Lecture 11, Cost of Production. As a young man fresh out of college, where I played ice hockey for the University of Arizona Ice Cats, I looked at the TCC where we played our games, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to take over the business of the concession stands at the TCC where there you have concerts and sporting events and try to make money selling food. When you have a concession stand, you have all sorts of items from hot dogs, peanuts, pizza, beer, sodas, nachos, and you have to come up with a pricing system. The nice thing about the Tucson Community Center is once people get in the building, they can't go anyplace else to get beer or food, and so I can charge monopoly prices. As a business owner, I have to come up with some sort of pricing structure. This was 1982, so the numbers that I'm going to show you are from way back when. And I had to come up with the price of the hot dogs. And I felt that if it was a concert where the arena seats 10,000 people and I'm selling food, hot dogs being one thing, that if I priced hot dogs at $1, I could sell 1,000 hot dogs. If I raise the price to $1.25, what do you think happened to demand? Nothing. Something happens to the quantity demanded. As the price goes up, that changes the quantity demanded. If I raise the price to $1.50, what do you think happened to demand? Nothing. Something happened to the quantity demanded. So I write these numbers down, and again, this is just guesswork if there were 10,000 people sitting in the arena and I'm charging them these different prices. Again, these are 1982 prices. At $5, 50 people would buy, and at $10, I would find three customers to buy hot dogs. By looking at this, you're the business owner. What price would you charge for the hot dogs? Is there anybody who would charge $10 for the hot dog? No. $5? No. $2? No. Out of these other three prices, $1.50, $1.25, or $1, how much would you sell your hot dogs for? Well, let me help you out. You definitely wouldn't sell at $10 because only three people would buy because maybe they wanted to show off to their friend that they have money in their pocket. Maybe they're really hungry. But let's multiply these numbers now. You get 1,000, 1,000, 750, 400, 250, and 30. So how much would you sell the hot dogs for? And many of you are going to say 125. Remember, all I've given you is the price times the quantity, which gives you the total revenue. And we've already taught you this. Total revenue does not equal profit. I haven't given you the cost to produce these hot dogs. Let's go through how much it costs to produce these units of output that I think are going to be bought in the marketplace. The total cost to produce 1,000 hot dogs is $330. The total cost to produce 800 is $290. To produce 500, $230. To produce 200, $135, $50, $125. But watch how much it costs to produce hot dogs. Just kidding you. It would cost $116. Why would it cost $116 to produce only 3 hot dogs? Because most of those costs are taken up by what are considered to be fixed cost. The rent, the machinery, the equipment, and so forth. When we look at this, then we can figure out what the profit is. Profit is total revenue minus the total cost will give you the profit. If I sell hot dogs for $1, I could make a profit of $6.70. If I sold hot dogs at $1.25, I could make a profit of $7.10. At $1.50, $520. At $2, $265. At $5, $125. And then at $10, I'm operating in the And you might say red, but today they don't print the numbers in red if they're losing. They print them in parentheses. So we're going to call this operating in the parentheses. If you operate in the parentheses, that means you're earning a loss. When you look at this right here, no doubt about it, how much are you going to sell your hot dogs for? You're going to sell it for $1.25. But if you picked $1.25 earlier because you did some figuring by looking at these numbers, you just lucked out because you didn't know what the costs were until I posted them. If you're a business owner, then everybody, are you in business to make a profit? The answer is quite obvious. No, you're in business to maximize your profits. Notice you picked 125 because that's where profit was maximized. But if you're just in business to make a profit, you could sell the hot dogs for $1, $1.50, $2, or $5. But you chose $1.25 because that's where you maximize profits. Now, don't think this is greedy. By maximizing profits, this leaves more money in your pockets to donate to worthy causes. And I don't think that's greedy at all. Or it allows you to save some money off to the side in case times get bad. You can keep the business running and keep your people employed. A lot of people think that businesses are greedy when they say they're there to maximize profits. They're not. They're either saving up for a rainy day or they're going to give back to the community. Now, obviously, some businesses decide to pay their officers more money. That's based upon self-interest, but that's their prerogative as long as customers are willing to pay for their product. Some people think that you should share that money with all of your employees. They can go ahead and think that, but if the owner of the business doesn't want to do that, the owner has every right to keep the profits of the business. Take out the sheet of paper that I gave you that has the fixed costs, the variable costs, and the total costs on the one side, and on the back side has the average fixed costs, average variable costs, average total cost, and marginal cost. But we're going to look at the fixed cost, variable cost, and total cost. So on your paper, you have something that looks like this. What we're going to do is we're going to look at what fixed costs are. Fixed costs are those costs that remain constant whether you produce 0 units to an infinite amount of units. Let's go back now to the example on the fixed cost of producing hot dogs. So what are the fixed costs of producing hot dogs? Number one, I have to pay either rent or mortgage for the factory. In this situation, I had to pay the TCC rent to become the concessionaire, so that was one of my fixed costs. I had to get a business license. When you get a business license, you have to pay your upfront cost of the application process, plus every 3 months, I get sent in the mail my business license where I have to pay a certain amount each quarter. It's the same amount for the entire year. That becomes a fixed cost. Next, I have what is called machinery or equipment. When I pay for my machines, I take out a loan and I pay the bank the same amount month after month after month, or I have to pay for my equipment, same thing, I take out a loan. A lot of times you don't want to use your cash on hand to pay for this equipment and machines in cash because one of the great failures of business is a shortage of cash on hand. When times get tough or unexpected bills come up and you start running low on cash, you might have to run to the bank. And let's say times are bad and banks aren't lending. If you run into a cash flow problem and you can't pay some of your costs, then you're going to have to shut down your business. Remember, it's okay to borrow as long as you think you can pay it off sometime in the future. Because if you don't have this cash on hand, again, it might set you up for failure. Another fixed cost you might have is a salary worker. Once you pay for a salary worker, you sign a contract with that worker, and you're going to pay that worker the same amount every single month. Those are your fixed costs of doing business. The next type of cost you have are your variable costs. The variable costs are those costs that change or go up when a firm produces, look at this, one unit to an infinite amount of units. Your variable costs don't start until you produce the first unit. Let's look at the hot dog stand. What was the variable cost of producing hot dogs? We already know what the fixed costs are. The first variable cost are the hot dogs. So I have to pay my supplier the hot dogs. And this will vary with output. As more people are buying hot dogs, I need, quote unquote, more hot dogs. The buns become a variable cost. The little envelope that you put the buns in. You have all the condiments. You have ketchup, mustard, relish, onions, so forth. These costs then rise as the concert is a bigger concert. More people are coming to get food. But then you have your wage workers. Wage workers are a variable cost to you. If you think it's going to be a bigger concert, you're going to hire more wage workers as compared to maybe a hockey game in Tucson, which draws fewer people. Then you don't have to hire as many wage workers. That varies with output. And then the total cost is your fixed cost plus your variable cost of production. The next part of this lesson is to draw a graph with the fixed cost, the variable cost, and the total cost. Go ahead on the attached sheet that you copied and printed, press pause, and draw your fixed cost on the graph. If you did it correctly, your fixed cost would be a straight line at $1,000 going from zero all the way to infinity. Obviously, a business isn't going to produce to infinity, but as your quantity keeps on increasing. Take your time now and plot the dots for your variable costs. If you did this correctly, this is what the graph would look like of your variable cost. Your variable costs keep climbing, and as they keep climbing, please realize it would look something like this between 1 and 9, and your variable costs then just keep climbing. Go ahead now and plot the dots for your total cost. And if you plotted the dots correctly, it looks something similar to this. Notice I'm going to go ahead and connect it from 1 to 10 here. What would happen on this graph if I got rid of the fixed cost of doing business? Let's say we just took this off the graph. Could I tell at any quantity what the fixed costs are going to be? It's quite obvious that I could tell right here that the fixed costs are going to be 1,000. Remember, this is in thousands. Because I know that I only have fixed cost at 0, and that's 1,000, that the fixed cost is 1,000. But what would happen if I did this? I didn't have this part of the graph here. Could I tell without this part of the graph or this part of the graph at any quantity, could I tell what the fixed costs are? Well, the fixed cost at any quantity is the difference between the total cost and the variable cost. So between these 2 points, any of these points right here, and it may look like an optical illusion, and it's not, but the difference between these points is 1,000. Well, I can tell by looking at this graph that TC minus VC is equal to FC. And what we can do now on a graph is get rid of the fixed cost, and at any points on the total cost and the variable cost, the difference between the two is the fixed cost. In fact, what I'd like you to do with this graph, probably from this point forward, is never use it again. Now, why would I do something like that to you? Why would I have you graph something and then tell you to scribble it all out? Because most people think that total cost is important and variable cost is important and fixed cost is important. But when reading graphs in economics, we like looking at the average. What I'd like you to do is either flip the paper or go to the other piece of paper that has your average fixed cost, your average variable cost, your average total cost, and most importantly in economics, your marginal cost. Let's look at our average fixed cost, our average variable cost, our average total cost, and most importantly, our marginal cost. And let's put this on a graph. So go ahead and plot the dots starting at the 7th unit and working your way all the way to the 18th unit. Go ahead and plot the dots. If you did it correctly, this is what it should look like. Now, if you notice, I already have the 5th and 6th, even though I don't have it in the table. I've gone ahead and plotted it on the graph. Notice as you increase your production, your average fixed costs continue to go down. The reason they continue to go down is you're taking your fixed cost of 1,000 and dividing it by a higher quantity. 7, 8, 9, 10. So your average fixed cost will always slope downward from left to right. Go ahead now and graph the average variable cost. Plot the dots on your sheet of paper. If you did it correctly, and now I've added the 5th and the 6th units, if you've done it correctly, you will notice that the average variable starts to go down to this point right here, the 10th unit, and then begins to rise. Notice how it begins to rise, going from 110 to 207. As you plot these dots, notice that the AVC goes downward to the 10th unit. Notice that the lowest point is at the 10th unit at 109. Make that dot a really big dot. That'll become important later in this discussion. Let's go ahead and graph now the ATC. So go ahead and take your time and graph the ATC from the 5th unit to the 18th unit. And if you did it correctly, it should look something like this. Notice here that the average total cost begins to go down all the way to the 13th unit. And beyond the 13th unit, notice how we made this dot really big right here. That beyond the 13th unit, the average total costs begin to climb. So they begin to go down and then they begin to climb. Everybody see this? That the average total costs begin to go down to this point and then begins to climb. Notice it goes down to this point on the red, or the average variable cost, until the 10th unit, and then it begins to climb. This again will become important later on in our discussion. So at the lowest point, which is 13, and the average total cost is 195. A few important points. Remember that the ATC, the brown line, looks like a smiley face. From now on, you won't be plotting any more dots. You'll just be drawing the graph. So the average total cost looks like a smiley face. The AVC looks like a smirk. Notice that it's not quite a a smile. It looks like sort of a smirk, that somebody's only smiling out of half of their mouth. You see how it looks like a smirk? If we got rid of the AFC, we're talking about this. If we get rid of the AFC, this line right here, and just got rid of this, could you figure out what the AFC is without that curve? And the answer is yes. The difference between ATC and AVC is AFC. Notice that the difference between ATC and AVC is identical to the difference between the x-axis and the AFC. So no matter where I pick on the graph the difference between ATC and AVC, that would be the same difference between the x-axis and the AFC. So we can get rid of AFC and be able to figure out AFC by taking ATC and subtracting AVC. Notice as AFC starts to head downwards, at first the difference between ATC and AVC is large. But because AFC is getting smaller and smaller here, the difference between ATC and AVC gets smaller and smaller here. So make sure you draw your ATC and AVC curves correctly. At first, they're far apart, but as you continue to produce more and more units of output, these get closer and closer and closer together. So the difference between ATC and AVC is AFC. From now on, you will not be drawing too many AFC curves unless instructed to do so. The reason, of course, is obvious. If you put the ATC and the AVC curve on the graph, you should be able to figure out the AFC at any quantity. But the most important cost is the marginal cost. Let's go ahead and graph the marginal cost. Notice that marginal cost starts to go downward and then at some point starts to climb. And how it climbs and where it touches AVC and ATC become important in economics. This is the marginal cost curve. Again, notice that at first the marginal cost goes down to the 9th unit, where marginal cost is at its lowest point. And then it begins to climb. Notice it starts up from 30 and heads all the way to 655. A few important points. The marginal cost curve, when you draw it now, looks like the Nike swoosh. So don't draw it jagged like I drew it on this graph. Make it look like the Nike swoosh. Number 2, the marginal cost touches the average variable cost and the average total cost at their lowest points. So remember, when you draw the marginal cost curve, draw it like the Nike swoosh, and then next make sure that the marginal cost touches the average variable and the average total at their lowest points. The last item I want to talk to about cost curves is the law of diminishing marginal returns. As more and more of a variable input is added to a fixed input, as more, let's say, wage workers are added to a machine, the additional output begins to go down. The reason this happens is as more people are added to one machine, there's a backup at that machine, and as there's a backup, the additional output begins to go down. And if the additional output begins to go down at some point, then that means your additional cost of producing that item begin to go up. Your marginal costs begin to climb. On this graph, I'm going to point out on the graph where the law of diminishing marginal returns sets in. Diminishing marginal returns sets in at the lowest point on the marginal cost curve. Anywhere beyond this point, the additional costs begin to rise because as you add more and more of a variable input, a wage worker, to a machine, the additional output begins to go down, which drives up the additional cost of production. This is the end of lecture 11 on the cost of production.